They laughed at his shaking hands. They mocked his limp. But when the kill team breached the door, they made one fatal mistake. They didn't break into a factory. They walked inside a 50,000-volt electric chair. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the corrugated metal roof of the North Point distribution substation. Inside, the air hummed with the menacing buzz of 345,000 volts. It's a sound that makes normal people uneasy, a constant reminder of invisible death, but for Frank Miller, it was a lullaby. Frank was 62 years old, sporting a permanent limp in his left leg, a souvenir from a workplace accident in the late 80s that he never talked about. He moved slowly, his back hunched under the weight of a leather tool belt that looked like it had survived a war. Because it had. Tonight, Frank was pulling the graveyard shift with a crew of 3 apprentices who looked like they were barely out of high school. The ringleader was a kid named Jax. Jax was all loud mouth and scrolling on his phone, leaning against a transformer housing that was clearly marked, Danger. "Yo, careful there, Pops," Jax sneered, watching Frank struggle to tighten a bolt on a breaker box. "Don't break a hip. We got actual work to do if you want to go nap in the truck." The other 2 kids, terrified of Jax, snickered nervously. Frank didn't even look up. He just kept turning his wrench with a steady, rhythmic motion. "Respect the current, son," Frank mumbled, his voice gravelly and low. "It doesn't care how young you are. It'll cook you from the inside out just the same." Jax laughed, flicking a cigarette but onto the grated floor. Yeah, whatever. Grandpa. Just hurry up so we can order pizza." The atmosphere in the plant was thick with ozone and the smell of wet concrete. To the kids, this was just a boring Tuesday night babysitting a bunch of wires. They saw cables and switches. But Frank saw potential energy. He saw a sprawling nervous system of lethal power waiting to be unleashed. He wiped grease from his hands with a rag, his eyes scanning the shadows in the rafters. He had been feeling an itch between his shoulder blades for the last hour. It was a sensation he hadn't felt since his days operating deep behind enemy lines in Eastern Europe. The air pressure was changing, and it wasn't just the storm outside. Something was coming. "Check the perimeter logs," Frank said suddenly, standing up straighter than he had all night. "Relax, old man," Jax groaned. "Nobody comes out here." But Frank wasn't listening. He was listening to the sound of the rain changing tempo against the loading dock door. The rhythm had broken. Someone was cutting through the noise. The silence that followed Frank's warning was shattered not by a sound, but by an explosion of motion. The heavy steel doors of the loading bay didn't open. They were blown off their hinges with a controlled directional charge. The concussion wave knocked Jax and the other 2 apprentices flat on their backs, their ears ringing. Before the smoke even cleared, 6 figures moved into the facility. They moved with a fluidity that screamed professional training. Black tactical gear, night vision goggles, and suppressed carbines raised and ready. This wasn't a robbery. This was a takeover. Hands. On the ground. Now. The lead intruder barked, his voice distorted by a gas mask. Jax, hyperventilating and shaking, scrambled to his knees, hands in the air. "Don't shoot. I'm just an intern. I don't know anything." The leader, a man whose posture suggested heavy military background, walked over and kicked Jax in the ribs, sending him sprawling. "Silence. Secure the control room. We need the grid down in 3 minutes to bypass the bank security downtown. Cut the hard lines." Frank had been near the back of the breaker array when the door blew. The explosion had shielded him from direct line of sight for a split second. In that second, the limp that Frank had nursed for 20 years vanished. He dropped low, sliding silently behind a bank of capacitors. He watched through the gaps in the machinery as the squad zip-tied the terrifying young workers. These men were pros. They were sweeping the room efficiently, checking corners. They were looking for threats, but they were looking for security guards or cops. They weren't looking for an electrician. "Boss, thermal shows 4 heat signatures," one of the mercenaries said, checking a tablet. "We only have 3 hostages." The leader scanned the room, his laser sight cutting through the haze. "Find the 4th. No witnesses. Kill him and dump him in the coolant tank." Frank pressed his back against the cold steel of a transformer. His heart rate didn't spike. It actually slowed down. This was familiar territory. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. He wasn't Frank the janitor-level electrician anymore. He was back in the field. He reached into his belt, not for a weapon, but for his heavy-duty wire strippers. The mercenaries wanted to cut the power? Frank smirked in the darkness. He was going to give them exactly what they wanted, but not in the way they expected. From his crouched position behind the Phase B regulator, Frank analyzed the battlefield. To anyone else, this was a factory floor. To Frank, it was a giant, loaded weapon. He looked at the mercenaries moving methodically through the aisles. They were wearing standard-issue combat boots with thick rubber soles, good for insulation, but not perfect. They were carrying radios, electronic sights, and flashlights. Internal monologue: 6 hostiles. Standard spread formation. They're confident, sloppy on the flanks. They think the darkness is their ally because they have night vision capability, NVGs. Mistake. NVGs restrict peripheral vision to 40 degrees. They have tunnel vision. Frank looked up at the overhead bus bars, thick copper rails carrying thousands of amps. He looked at the hydraulic pressure lines feeding the cooling systems. He looked at the compressed air tanks used for the pneumatic switches. Amperage on the main line is holding at 2000. Voltage is 13.8 kV stepped down to 480. If I bridge the gap on the capacitor bank, I can create an arc flash. Instant blindness. But I need to separate them first. He glanced at his own hands. They were steady. He closed his eyes for a second, letting his pupils fully dilate. Years of working in subterranean tunnels for government sanitation jobs had given him a unique edge. His eyes were hypersensitive to low light. He didn't need green phosphor screens to see. He could navigate by the faintest glimmer of LEDs and the contrast of shadows. He looked at the main breaker handle, a massive lever 30 feet away. If he pulled that, the entire building would go pitch black. The emergency lights were on a separate circuit he had disabled last week for maintenance and hadn't reconnected yet. Total blackout, Frank calculated. They lose the advantage of their tech. I gain the advantage of the terrain. I know every bolt, every trip hazard, every hanging wire in this building. They're tourists. I'm the landlord. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a spool of high-tensile copper wire and a handful of ceramic insulators. He wasn't just going to hide. He was going to turn the substation into a haunted house, and he was the poltergeist. The mercenaries were looking for a man with a gun. They weren't expecting a man who could weaponize physics. Frank took a deep breath, smelling the ionization in the air. It smelled like victory. Frank moved like smoke. For a guy who supposedly had a bad leg, he traversed the catwalks with the grace of a jungle cat. He reached the main distribution panel, the heart of the facility's lighting system. He didn't just flip the switch. That would be too simple. He jammed a screwdriver into the relay mechanism, shattering the plastic casing and severing the control wire. Click. Whir. Thud. The hum of the overhead halogen lights died instantly. The facility plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The only light came from the dim, blinking red LEDs of the instrument panels and the sporadic flashes of lightning through the skylights. Contact. Lights cut. One of the mercenaries shouted. Switching to IR. Below, beams of invisible infrared light, visible only through their goggles, began sweeping the room. But Frank was already gone. He had shimmied up a conduit pipe and was now perched on top of a massive crane gantry, 20 feet in the air. He watched them adjust. The leader signaled 2 men to secure the rear exit. That was their mistake. They were splitting up. Frank crawled along the gantry, positioning himself directly over a hydraulic cooling line. The line was pressurized at 3,000 psi. He pulled out his heavy wrench. He didn't need to cut the line fully. He just needed to compromise the fitting. He timed it with a clap of thunder outside. Crack. He smashed the valve. A jet of hydraulic fluid hissed out, spraying a fine mist of oil across the concrete floor below, directly in the path of the 2 rear guards. Leak. We got a leak. One guard yelled, his voice tight. "Ignore it. Find the target," the leader commanded over the radio. Frank smiled grimly. "Hydraulic fluid is slippery. Extremely slippery." As the two guards rushed toward the back wall, the lead man's boot hit the oil slick. He went down hard, his rifle clattering away. The second man tried to stop, lost his footing, and slid into a stack of metal conduit pipes, causing a deafening crash. Man down. It's slick everywhere. Frank didn't wait. While they were distracted by the noise, he slid down a cable on the opposite side of the room. He needed to get to the high-voltage testing bay. That's where the real toys were. He wasn't just slowing them down anymore. He was hurting them. The mercenaries were rattled. The darkness, the noise, the slick floors, it was messing with their coordination. The leader, sensing they were losing control of the environment, grew aggressive. "Stop messing around. Thermal scan the rafters. Shoot anything that moves." Frank was currently hiding inside the cab of a decommissioned forklift parked in the shadows of the loading zone. He watched a mercenary approach, sweeping his rifle barrel left and right. The mercenary was walking right past the high bay storage racks, shelves stacked with massive spools of industrial cable, each weighing about 500 pounds. Frank spotted a retention strap holding back a pallet of copper ingots on the shelf above the mercenary. It was held in place by a tension buckle. Frank didn't have a gun, but he had his Klein lineman pliers. He also had a handful of heavy steel nuts he'd picked up. He needed a distraction. Frank threw a heavy bolt across the room. It clanged against a hollow metal cabinet. The mercenary spun around, aiming at the noise. Contact right. In that split second of distraction, Frank grabbed a pneumatic nail gun he had stashed on the forklift. It was hooked up to a portable air compressor tank. He wasn't aiming at the man. He was aiming at the buckle on the shelf above him. Thwack! The nail flew true, shattering the plastic release clip of the retention strap. Gravity took over. The pallet tipped. 300 pounds of solid copper ingots rained down. The mercenary heard the groan of the wood above him and looked up, but it was too late. The heavy metal crashed down, burying him under a mountain of copper. He didn't even have time to scream. The impact shook the floor. "Man down. Sector 4. The roof is collapsing," screamed another guard. "It's not the roof, you idiot," the leader roared. "It's a trap. Tighten up." Back to back, Frank slipped out of the forklift, melting back into the shadows. He had taken out one. 5 to go, but now they were clustered together, terrified and angry. They were moving toward the center of the room, away from the shelves. Exactly where Frank wanted them. They were heading toward the switchgear maze, a narrow labyrinth of electrical panels. The remaining 5 mercenaries formed a tight defensive circle, moving like a phalanx into the rows of towering gray electrical cabinets. This was the switchgear room, a maze of narrow corridors created by rows of high-voltage equipment. It was claustrophobic, and with the lights out, it felt like a tomb. "Come out, old man," the leader shouted, his voice echoing off the metal surfaces. "We have the hostages. You surrender now, or we start executing them." Frank froze. He was hidden atop a cable tray, looking down at them. He could see Jax and the other kids zip-tied to a railing near the entrance, guarded by one mercenary while the other 4 hunted him. He knew these types of men. They weren't bluffing. He had to act fast. He couldn't pick them off one by one anymore. He needed a force multiplier. He needed to turn the room itself into a weapon. The mercenaries were sweeping the aisles, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. Check every panel. He's in here somewhere. Frank looked at the floor. The substation floor was a grid of metal grating suspended over a concrete subfloor that housed the grounding cables. The mercenaries were walking on the metal grating. Frank crawled silently along the cable tray until he was directly over the main bus duct that fed that specific row of cabinets. He pulled out his insulated knife. He wasn't going to cause an explosion. That would kill the hostages too. He needed something precise. He located the fire suppression system's manual override valve. It was an older system, halon gas, designed to suck the oxygen out of the air to kill electrical fires. But he didn't trigger that. Instead, he looked at the water pipes running above the electrical gear, a code violation he had complained about for years. Finally, Frank thought lazy management is good for something. He loosened the coupling on the water pipe. A steady drip began to fall. Not a flood, just a trickle. It landed on the metal grating floor, right in the center intersection of the maze. The mercenaries were inching closer to the wet spot. They didn't see the water on the dark metal. They only saw the shadows. Frank realized he was cornered in the maze, but so were they. It was time for a physics lesson. Frank watched from the darkness, his mind racing through formulas. He needed to create a step potential trap. In high-voltage engineering, step potential is the difference in voltage between a person's 2 feet. If the ground is energized, and you take a step, electricity travels up one leg and down the other, frying everything in between. Internal monologue: the floor grating is steel. Conductive. The mercenaries are wearing rubber-soled boots, rated for maybe 600 volts. Standard, tactical issue. But I have access to the 4160-volt feeder line right here in the tray. If I drop a live-phase conductor onto that wet grating, the voltage will energize the entire steel floor grid. He calculated the resistance. The water would ensure a solid connection between the wire and the grate. The steel grate would become a live plate. Their boots will insulate them for about 0.5 seconds. At 4000 volts, the dielectric strength of that rubber will break down instantly. The electricity will arc through their soles. But the hostages are tied to the railing near the door. That railing is grounded separately to the building frame. They are safe. The mercenaries are standing on the floating grid. It was a risky move. If Frank messed up the calculation, he could kill the kids. He checked the grounding bonds again visually. Yes. The section the mercenaries were standing on was isolated by the rubber vibration pads under the cabinets. It was an island of steel. Frank took a deep breath. He grabbed the 4 kV cable. He used his insulated cutters to strip the heavy jacketing, revealing the gleaming copper strands, thick as a thumb. The hum of the wire vibrated through his gloves. This was death in his hands. He needed to drop the wire and jump to the insulated cable tray in the same motion. He looked at the leader, who was standing right in the middle of the puddle. "I see movement above," one mercenary yelled, raising his rifle. "Now," Frank whispered. "Eat this," Frank grunted. He swung the severed, live 4160-volt cable down like a whip. The copper tip struck the puddle of water on the metal grating directly between the 4 mercenaries. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Zzz crack boom. A blinding sphere of blue-white plasma erupted at the point of contact. The sound was like a cannon firing in a closet. The air instantly expanded, creating a shockwave that rattled the teeth of everyone in the building. The steel grating became an electrified surface of pure agony. The mercenaries' boots didn't stand a chance. The high voltage punched through the rubber soles, traveled up their legs, and locked their muscles in a titanic contraction. They couldn't scream. Their diaphragms were frozen. They couldn't let go of their guns. Their hands were clamped shut. They just stiffened, vibrating violently as the blue arcs of electricity danced across the wet floor, seeking a path to ground. The leader, standing closest to the impact, was thrown backward by the arc blast, his tactical vest smoking. The other 3 collapsed in a heap, twitching as the residual current dissipated. Frank, perched high on the insulated fiberglass cable tray, shielded his eyes from the flash. He felt the heat of the arc, hotter than the surface of the sun for a fraction of a second. The breaker finally tripped upstream, plunging the room back into silence, save for the smell of burnt rubber and hair. Frank looked down. The 4 men in the maze were down, but the 5th man, the one guarding the hostages, had been outside the kill zone. He was stunned, blinded by the flash, but he was still standing. He began blindly firing his weapon toward the ceiling in panic. Bang! 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 Sparks flew near Frank's head. He had to finish this. Frank didn't hesitate. He dropped from the rafters, landing heavily on his bad leg. Pain shot up his spine, but adrenaline masked it. The last mercenary was rubbing his eyes, trying to clear the flash blindness. his gun waving erratically at the hostages. "Stay back. I'll kill them," the mercenary screamed, hearing Frank land. Frank didn't stop. He picked up a heavy length of conduit pipe from the floor. He didn't run, he marched. The mercenary fired a shot, but it went wild, hitting a control panel. Frank swung the pipe. It connected with the mercenary's wrist, shattering the bone and sending the gun flying. A swift, brutal kick to the kneecap dropped the man to the ground, followed by a solid blow to the head with the pipe. Silence returned to the substation. Frank stood there, chest heaving, the pipe dripping with rain and sweat. He limped over to the main breaker, the manual override, and slammed it back into the on position. THUM hum. The massive transformers roared back to life. The overhead lights flickered and buzzed on, flooding the room with harsh yellow light. The scene was chaotic. The mercenaries were groaning on the floor, incapacitated. The floor was scorched black. Jax and the apprentices were huddled together, eyes wide, staring at Frank. Minutes later, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. The SWAT team breached the doors, weapons raised, screaming, "Police! Drop your weapons!" They stopped dead in their tracks. They saw the pile of highly trained paramilitary soldiers, incapacitated, tied up with zip ties and copper wire. They saw the complex electrical traps. The SWAT leader lowered his rifle, looking at the scorched floor and the groaning villains. Who did this? Where's the tactical team? Jax, shaking, pointed a trembling finger at the corner. There sat Frank, calmly drinking a lukewarm coffee from his thermos, checking a clipboard. "It was just him," Jax whispered. "Just the electrician." The sun was coming up as the police finished their sweep. Paramedics were loading the mercenaries into ambulances. They would survive, but they'd be facing a long time in prison and extensive physical therapy. Frank walked out of the substation, his tool belt over his shoulder. The rain had stopped, leaving the morning air crisp and clean. He was limping badly now. The adrenaline had worn off, and his old joints were screaming. The site manager was there, talking to the press, trying to figure out what happened. But the young apprentices were waiting by Frank's truck. Jax stepped forward. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a look of pure reverence. He looked at the old man, then at the devastation inside the plant, then back at the old man. "Frank," Jax stammered. I didn't know. The way you took out the grid, the arc flash. It was a violation of safety protocol, kid," Frank grunted, opening the door of his battered pickup truck. "Don't try it at home." Jax reached out. "Let me carry your tools, Mr. Miller." Frank paused. He looked at the kid. For the first time in years, he smiled, a genuine tired smile. He handed the heavy belt to Jax. "Careful with those," Frank said. "They've got a history." Frank climbed into the truck and started the engine. As he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror. The kids weren't on their phones. They were standing in a row, watching him leave, standing at attention. They finally understood. It's not the tools that make the master. It's the hands that hold them.